Municipalities in KwaZulu-Natal now have been found liable for violating residents' right to accessing clean drinking water. This was revealed in the SA Human Rights Commission's report, which probed the water issues in the province. The Commission conducted a 5-day inquiry last month into water access after receiving over 600 complaints dating as far back as 2020, but the issue dates further back than that. Some people say 10, even 15 years old. So let's unpack the findings with one of the panelists of that inquiry. Professor Tafadzwa Mabhaudhi from the University of KZN is also a climate change, water and food systems expert from the International Water Management Institute. Prof, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for making time for us this Tuesday morning. And, you know, the report by the Human Rights Commission has now said in black and white what we've known for many, many years, some say 10, 15 years, that the rights of residents of particular areas in the province has been violated for some time.
Good morning, and thanks very much for having me. Yes, the report does come out strongly in terms of stating the state's constitutional mandate and obligation in terms of the provision of sufficient water to citizens and people in the country, as well as the obligations thereafter of municipalities as water service authorities and responsible for service delivery to ensure the realization of that particular right and the implications of that right not being realized in terms of the interrelated rights. So the report is quite firm and strong in its language related to that.
Yeah. I suppose it's easy for people who are not in those areas affected by this water crisis to look at this and not really get a sense of how people's lives have been impacted in a very real way on a daily basis. Talking about elderly people who are using their grant money to buy water, people with young children, babies, women. What are some of the stories that you heard as a panelist, Prof?
We had quite a wide range of stories and definitely not good or encouraging stories. We had stories of young girls not being able to go to school because they have to walk long distances to go and fetch water. We had stories about the risks, of these girls being abused when they're walking to fetch water. We had stories of a particular hospital that has gone for a very long period without water. And you can imagine what it means for a hospital to be without water, because that has serious implications for its ability to deliver health. We heard of schools without water. We heard of communities that have not seen water in more than a year. So it was really sort of, depressing to hear such testimonies that were coming through.
Yeah, I mean, for our viewers who are listening, we open a tap and there's, in many parts of the country, clean water coming out of a tap. There are many people who don't know the reality that these residents have to live with. Some of them, as you say, for a year at a time, the problem dating back as far as 15 years. When you need water, to have to take a wheelbarrow and to then fill up buckets. And as you say, the risks insofar as our GBV numbers are concerned as well, when those people are young women.
Yeah, so you also have to look at it from the broader context of other rights that become undermined when the right to water is not realized. So your right to health, the right to food, the right to a safe space, the right to dignity itself, which is also enshrined in the Constitution, gets undermined. You also look at it from the space of widening inequalities, that so many years after, independence, we still have this situation in the country where previously marginalized communities continue to struggle with lack of access to water. And that means that we are perpetuating those inequalities, and the implications that it also has on children growing up in that context means we are creating a very vicious cycle of poverty. That's going to continue.
So when you say it was quite depressing as a panelist to hear these stories, Prof, I understand it, and our viewers will as well. It's really just disheartening to hear that these issues are the issues that we're still struggling with in 2023. on the issue of dignity as well. You know, in answering these questions, did the municipalities, and particularly perhaps the Ugu municipality, did they say enough insofar as, responding to what residents had to say when they described their daily lives? Did those municipalities say enough about the plans that are in place?
Look, there are two things that you always want to balance in a conflict or in a dispute resolution. First is accepting that someone is aggrieved and has been hurt, and accepting that as a state. And then second, sometimes you can give an explanation of which municipalities in several instances had valid reasons about why they are struggling, which range from old and aging infrastructure, lack of capacity within municipalities to address these. They're struggling with accessing and managing the grants. There's vandalism in some instances. The history of apartheid left them with a huge burden. But besides those issues, the reality is that we have people who are affected and whose lives are being inconvenienced. So whether municipalities had valid reasons or not, the fact of the matter is they have an obligation to ensure that people get to realize their right to access to water. And the Commission has put in place very firm and clear recommendations and guidelines in terms of what needs to be done, at what level, starting from national down to local municipalities, in terms of ensuring that that right is realized.
Yeah. And of course, the municipalities in many instances are shooting themselves in the foot, right? In the Ugu municipality, for example, which still considers itself, according to the response from officials, a tourism hub. It's had a major impact, as we know, on tourism numbers in a context where the province is still recovering from COVID-19 and the floods and the July riots of 2021.
Yes, indeed. You can't be a tourist hub where there's no access to water. And then it then turns around that when you create that and tourism suffers, tourism was a major source of employment to people in that community. So then people also lose the ability to work. They lose opportunities, for dignified jobs, which puts them in a worse off position thereafter. So that's the point also to realize that this has, further implications on many other things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Prof, you've said that the Human Rights Commission's scathing report has now made recommendations. Do timelines come with those recommendations as well, insofar as ensuring accountability here?
Yes, definitely. Several of the recommendations have clear timelines linked to the actions that need to be done, and in certain instances, the Commission has asked for a report back so that people do report back to it in terms of the progress that has been made in implementing these recommendations. Furthermore, they've also partnered with VITS to launch a water justice tracker, which will now allow them to have a national view of the state of water in terms of the realization of this right. So they'll be able to now monitor and evaluate in almost real time, the realization of that right. So that further strengthens their ability to hold, municipalities accountable.
Yeah. Prof, there's another issue that I'd actually just like to get your take on. There was one resident who addressed the inquiry who talked about her municipal bill. She described that for 58% of the time, she had said out of 250 odd days, they only had water in her area for less than half of those days. So 58% of the time, there was no access to water, and yet her municipal bill remained high. Did the recommendations from the Human Rights Commission say anything on this score?
So the recommendations touched on the need for municipalities to have effective billing systems, because one of the challenges also raised by municipalities is with regards to their failure to collect revenue, but that is also linked to them not having in place proper billing systems. So most municipalities do need to implement proper and effective billing systems and be able to charge fairly and reasonably and transparently for water, and then be able to collect the charges that are due to them correctly.
Yeah. So Prof, insofar as the recommendations are concerned, you've spoken to us about timelines as well. But does the inquiry now, check in regularly with these municipalities to see where they are in implementing?
Yeah, I believe there are mechanisms for the Human Rights Commission to do so. Even as we were having the launch yesterday, they had some of their team out on the ground, further investigating certain, information that has come to light. And there's going to be continued engagement and follow-up with the municipalities in terms of how they move forward in implementing the recommendations that were contained in the report.
Important point as well. Professor Tafadzwa Mabhaudhi, let me thank you for your time this morning. Such an important discussion, and certainly insofar as our coverage is concerned, an important story we've got our eyes on as well. The Prof is a water and food systems expert with the International Water Management Institute and with UKZN.